The rain hit the harbour glass like static, and Aisha Bello had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether to scream or run. She chose neither. She froze, spine pressed to the cold service elevator wall, watching the man in the tailored black coat step toward her with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Behind him, 2 of the men who'd been chasing her through the hotel's lower kitchens lay groaning on the tile. She hadn't seen him move. She'd only heard it bone against bone, breath knocked out of throats, and then silence. "Stay calm," he said, voice low, almost gentle, "or I will take you to my room." It should have terrified her more than the men who'd grabbed her purse and mistaken her for someone else's mark. Instead, something in her chest turned over, slow and unwilling, like a key finding a lock it didn't know existed. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and fixed on her like she was the only solvable equation in a burning building. "Who are you?" she breathed. He didn't answer. He simply extended a hand, blood on his knuckles, and waited. "Welcome to Afro Soul Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe." Aisha hadn't meant to end up in the service corridor of the Chinji Grand at 11 at night. She'd meant to clock out, collect her tips from the banquet she'd been catering, and go home to a cold apartment and a colder bank account. Seoul had promised her a fresh start after her design scholarship fell through. Instead, it had given her double shifts and a landlord who raised the rent every time the exchange rate blinked. The men who cornered her thought she was someone else, a courier maybe, carrying something they wanted. She never found out what. All she knew was hands closing around her arm, a voice hissing in Korean too fast to catch, and then the world tilting sideways as a shadow peeled off the wall and became a man built like consequence itself. Now she stood in a private elevator, her back to gleaming brass, watching Dae-hyun study her like she was a puzzle he intended to keep. "Bleeding," she said, nodding at his hand. "It isn't mine." "That's not comforting." Corner of his mouth almost moved. "Almost." "Nothing about tonight was meant to comfort you. It was meant to keep you alive." Elevator doors opened onto a penthouse floor she hadn't known existed, private, unmarked, guarded by a man who bowed his head when Dae-hyun passed. She should have been afraid of the guards, the marble hush, the way every person here moved like they'd rehearsed obedience. Instead, she was afraid of how safe she suddenly felt, standing beside a stranger with blood on his hands. By morning, Aisha understood 2 things. First, Dae-hyun did not own a hotel. He owned an empire, shipping lines, construction conglomerates, half the harbour district, and beneath all of it, whispered about but never proven, a network that made rival businessmen go quiet when his name came up in meetings. Second, he had no intention of letting her walk back into the same street where men had grabbed her. "Have a life," she told him over coffee she hadn't asked for, in a penthouse kitchen larger than her entire apartment. "A job, a landlord who'll evict me if I don't show up." "Handled," he said, not looking up from his tablet. "That's not, you can't just handle my life." He looked up then, and the intensity in his gaze made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Someone tried to take you last night, Miss Bello, until I know why you are not going anywhere alone. You don't even know me." "I know enough," she wanted to argue. She wanted, more dangerously, to lean into the certainty in his voice. The way he said "handled," like the word itself, could rearrange the world around her. She'd spent 2 years in Seoul learning to need no one. She wasn't ready for a man whose presence alone made her feel like the ground had finally stopped shifting. The following morning, a driver arrived at what remained of her apartment. Her landlord apparently had received a call that made him suddenly very accommodating, to move 3 boxes of her life into a guest suite she hadn't agreed to occupy. Dae-hyun wasn't there to see it. He was, his assistant explained in back-to-back meetings, doing what powerful men do when their world briefly intersects with danger, making it disappear quietly, expensively, without ever raising his voice. She found the first gift on her 3rd night, a sketchbook, high-grade, the exact brand she used to buy before Seoul got expensive, sitting on the desk in her new room with no note. She stared at it a long time before she let herself smile. "I don't take charity," she told him at breakfast, sliding the sketchbook toward him. "It isn't charity, it's an investment." He didn't elaborate, only watched her over his coffee cup with an attention that made her feel unbearably seen. "You design. I saw the sketches on your phone the night we met. You dropped it in the corridor." Heat crawled up her neck. "You went through my phone." "I returned your phone. Looking wasn't the intent. Noticing was unavoidable." She didn't have an answer for that. She kept the sketchbook. A few days later, he took her to a gala she hadn't wanted to attend, his mother's foundation. He explained. An obligation he couldn't skip and apparently couldn't survive without a +1 to keep the matchmaking mothers of Seoul's elite at bay. Aisha wore a borrowed emerald gown that fit her curves like it had been made for her, because she'd learn later it had. The room quieted when they walked in together. Whispers followed, sharp and curious. Who is she? Where did he find her? Is she the reason he cancelled the Song family dinner? She endured it until a man in a silver suit sidled up beside her at the bar, hand grazing her waist a beat too long, voice a beat too smooth. Dae-hyun doesn't share well, he said, smiling like a threat wrapped in charm. Which makes me curious why he brought a nobody like you tonight. She stiffened, and then Dae-hyun was there, not shouting, not making a scene, simply appearing at her side with a hand settling low on her back, warm and unmistakably claiming. Touch her again, he said quietly, and I will end you before you finish the sentence. Silver-suited man laughed it off, but his face had gone pale. Aisha's pulse hammered, not from fear this time, but from the way Dae-hyun's jaw ticked, the way his fingers pressed just slightly tighter against her spine, like he couldn't stand the idea of another man's hands anywhere near her. You didn't have to do that, she murmured later on the terrace, away from the noise. I didn't do it for you, he said, voice rough. I did it because I couldn't stop myself. He looked at her like the admission cost him something. That's never happened before. City lights blurred gold behind him. She should have stepped back, she stepped closer instead. That evening set something loose between them that neither could put back. It wasn't a single moment, it was 100 small ones stacking like kindling. He started appearing wherever she was, the atelier where she'd begun sketching again, the market where she bought fabric, the rooftop where she went to breathe. He never announced himself as protective. He simply was, a quiet, immovable presence at the edge of every space she occupied, until she stopped questioning why the world suddenly felt safer. Always just there, she said one night, finding him leaning against her studio doorway, having apparently waited an hour without a word of complaint. Would you prefer I wasn't? She should have said yes. The word wouldn't come. The tension broke on a night thick with an oncoming storm, sirens somewhere far off, thunder pressing low against the skyline. Dae-hyun had come home tense, jaw set, a call from his head of security still echoing in the tight lines of his shoulders. The men from the harbour corridor had been identified. They worked for a rival syndicate his family had crossed years ago. They hadn't been after her by accident, they'd been sent to find leverage, and now that leverage had a face. You should have told me, Aisha said, voice shaking when he finally explained. You've had me living in a fishbowl and you didn't tell me why. Because I didn't want you to be afraid. Rather be afraid and informed than protected and lied to. I have never lied to you. His voice cracked on the last word, unfamiliar to his own ears. I have only tried to keep the worst of my world from touching you, and I have failed because it already has, because the moment I saw you in that corridor, I knew I would burn everything down before I let anyone put their hands on you again. Confession hung raw in the stormlit room. Aisha's anger crumbled into something far more dangerous, the terrifying, thrilling understanding that this man, feared by boardrooms and rival empires alike, was standing in front of her utterly undone. Dae-hyun, he crossed the distance between them before she finished his name, hand cradling her jaw like she was something he'd been forbidden to want and had wanted anyway, every day in silence. Tell me to stop, he said hoarsely, and I will. She didn't tell him to stop. Thunder cracked outside as their lips met, hesitant first, then hungry, years of restraint breaking loose in the space of a single breath. His hands framed her face like she was something precious and volatile at once, hers fisted in his shirt like she was afraid the storm would take him if she let go. The rest of the world fell away, the syndicate, the empire, the danger circling closer with every passing hour, until there was nothing left but heat and breathless closeness, and two people finally admitting what they'd been fighting since a rain-soaked corridor changed everything. The lights of Seoul blurred gold and distant beyond the glass as the storm swallowed the city whole, and neither of them noticed it end. Morning came grey and quiet, the storm spent, the penthouse hushed in that particular stillness that follows something irreversible. Aisha woke first, sunlight slanting pale across sheets that weren't hers, and for one suspended moment she let herself feel only warmth, his arm heavy across her waist, his breathing slow and even against her hair. Then the fear crept in, the way it always did. He's now Dae-hyun. Powerful, feared, surrounded by women who'd trade their names for his attention. What was she really but a stray he'd swept off a rain-slicked street? Men like him didn't stay. They collected and then eventually they moved on, and she couldn't survive being a chapter in someone else's story when he'd already become the whole book of hers. She slipped from the bed before he woke. By the time Dae-hyun's eyes opened, the room was empty, her scent still on the pillow, her boxes, the ones his staff had moved in with such quiet efficiency, vanished from the guest suite entirely. A note sat on the kitchen counter, 4 words in her looping hand. I can't do this. He read it twice. Then he called his head of security, voice flat with a fury that made the man on the other end straighten instinctively even through the phone. Find her. Now. She hadn't gone far, she couldn't afford to, not really, not with the little cash she'd managed to save. A cramped hostel near the market district took the last of it, and Aisha sat on a stiff mattress telling herself she'd done the right thing, that walking away before he could was the only way to keep some piece of herself intact. It didn't feel like the right thing. It felt like tearing her own ribs open. She lasted 2 days before her phone, the one he'd insisted she keep, the one she hadn't had the heart to abandon, buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. I know where you are. I'm not coming to force you back. I am coming because I need you to hear something and then you can decide. She should have blocked the number. She left the door unlocked instead. He arrived that evening without bodyguards, without the armor of tailored suits and boardroom composure, just a man in a plain black coat, rain damp again, standing in the doorway of a hostel room too small to hold the weight of what he'd come to say. You left, he said quietly. I had to. Why? Because, her voice broke. Because men like you don't keep women like me, Dae-hyun. You acquire things, hotels, harbors, people sometimes when it's convenient, and I couldn't stand there and watch you realize that's all I was to you, so I left before you could show me. Something in his face cracked open, not anger, but grief, raw and unguarded in a way she'd never seen on him. Do you know what I did, he said, in the 11 years since I took over my father's company? I built walls. I learned to want nothing I couldn't afford to lose, because losing things in my world gets people killed. I have not been soft with anyone in over a decade. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see his hands were shaking. Then you dropped your sketchbook in a service corridor and I have not had a single quiet thought since. Dae-hyun, I am not acquiring you, Aisha. I am terrified of you. Because you are the first thing in my life I cannot control, cannot predict, cannot protect myself from, and I would still rather stand in this room and be undone by you than go back to a life where nothing could touch me. His voice dropped, rough and unguarded. Come home, not because I own the roof over your head, because I cannot survive the space where you aren't. Silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. And then Aisha crossed the small room and stepped into him, and he wrapped around her like he'd been drowning and finally found air. She returned to the penthouse that night, and for a few days, the world felt almost gentle, mornings of coffee and quiet laughter. Evenings of him coming home earlier than his assistants believed possible, just to sit beside her while she sketched. It felt dangerously like peace. Peace didn't last. The following morning, Dae-hyun's head of security arrived at breakfast with a face that made Aisha's stomach drop before a word was spoken. Sir, the Song Syndicate has made contact. They know about her. They're not asking for money. Dae-hyun's cup went still against the saucer. What do they want? They want to trade her for the harbor contracts your father signed away from them 15 years ago. They're giving you 72 hours. Color drained from Aisha's face. Trade me, like property. No, Dae-hyun said, low and lethal, rising from his chair with a stillness that was somehow more frightening than shouting. They are about to learn exactly how much of a mistake that offer was. By the end of the week, the city Aisha had learned to navigate, its markets, its rooftops, its quiet studio corners, had transformed into something unrecognizable. Guards doubled at every entrance. Dae-hyun barely slept, spending nights in his office with maps and ledgers spread across every surface, tracing decades-old grievances back to the men now circling his one weakness. You should send me away, Aisha said one night, finding him hunched over documents at 2 a.m., dark circles carved beneath his eyes. Somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach. He looked up at her and the exhaustion in his face didn't dim the fire in his eyes. There is no way that would keep you safer than beside me, and there is no version of this where I let another man decide what happens to you. He reached for her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles like a vow. I told you once I would burn my world down before I let anyone touch you. That was not a metaphor, Aisha, I meant it. She believed him. That terrified her more than the syndicate ever could. The danger sharpened 3 nights later. Aisha had gone against every instinct Dae-hyun's security team had drilled into her, to collect fabric from a small shop in the market district. A 5-minute errand, she told the guards stationed outside her studio, and she'd hated how caged she felt, how much of her old independence had folded itself into someone else's protection. She wanted just once to feel like herself again. She never made it back with the fabric. A car pulled alongside her on the narrow street, and before she understood what was happening, hands closed over her mouth, dragging her into the back seat as her phone clattered onto wet pavement, screen cracking, Dae-hyun's last message still glowing on the display. Come home soon. I miss you already. Dae-hyun received the call 20 minutes later, not from his security but from an unknown number, a voice smug with old grudges and new leverage. We have something of yours, the voice said. The harbor contracts signed back to us or you'll get her back in pieces. You have until dawn. The line went dead. Dae-hyun stood in the center of his office, phone still pressed to his ear, and for the first time in 11 years of building walls no one could breach, something inside him didn't calculate. It simply broke and reformed instantly into something far more dangerous than grief. He turned to his head of security, voice a blade honed to a single, unbreakable edge. Get me everyone, every man loyal to my father's name, every debt owed to this family for 2 decades. I don't care what it costs, I don't care who has to answer for it. His eyes, dark and merciless, fixed on the city skyline glittering cold beyond the glass. Tonight, the Song Syndicate learns that some things are not for sale, and Aisha is coming home before the sun rises, or none of them will live to regret taking her. Warehouse smelled of salt and rust, the harbour wind rattling loose sheet metal somewhere above her. Aisha sat bound to a chair, wrists raw, heart hammering not from despair, but from a strange, stubborn certainty settling beneath her fear. He's coming. She didn't know how she knew. She simply did, the way she'd known that first night in the service corridor that the man stepping out of the shadows would never let harm reach her twice. 2 guards flanked the door, murmuring in low Korean, occasionally glancing at their watches like men counting down to something they weren't sure they wanted to face. She understood enough to catch the fear threaded through their voices whenever they said his name. Dae-hyun. Good, she thought. Let them be afraid. Dawn was still an hour away when the first explosion of noise erupted at the warehouse's east entrance, not gunfire, not chaos, but the disciplined, devastating sound of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Aisha's guards startled upright, weapons raised, but they never stood a chance. The door didn't so much break open as cease to exist, and through the settling dust and shattered light, Dae-hyun walked in like judgment given a name. He wasn't in a suit. He wore black, simple and unadorned, blood already darkening one sleeve, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made the air itself feel thinner. Dae-hyun, don't move, he said, voice steady even as violence unfolded around him with brutal efficiency, his men fanning out, the syndicate's guards falling one by one beneath a resistance they clearly hadn't anticipated. He crossed the warehouse floor like the chaos around him didn't exist, kneeling before her chair, hands trembling, actually trembling, this man who never let anything touch him as he worked the ropes from her wrists. You came, she breathed. I told you. His voice cracked on the words, forehead pressing to hers the moment her hands were free. There is no version of this world where I don't come for you. A shout rose behind them, the syndicate's remaining leader cornered, weapon drawn, aimed not at Dae-hyun but at Aisha, a final desperate bid at the leverage slipping through his fingers. Dae-hyun moved before thought caught up to instinct, placing himself between the gun and the woman he loved, and for one suspended, terrible second, Aisha's whole world narrowed to the sound of a single shot. It missed. One of Dae-hyun's men had already closed the distance, disarming the shooter with brutal practiced speed, forcing him to his knees amid the wreckage of an empire that had just made its final, fatal miscalculation. Dae-hyun didn't turn to watch. His hands cupped Aisha's face instead, checking, searching, cataloguing every inch of her like he needed proof she was whole. I have you, he whispered. I have you, it's over. She collapsed against his chest, and he held her like the rest of the world had simply stopped existing. By the following morning, the Song Syndicate's collapse was already rippling through Seoul's shadow economy, old debts called in overnight, alliances Dae-hyun's father had spent decades building finally paying their due. The men responsible for Aisha's abduction would answer for it in ways the law would never need to touch. Dae-hyun made sure of that personally, and made sure, too, that no whisper of it would ever reach the woman sleeping finally, peacefully in his bed. She woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee, and to him sitting at the edge of the mattress, simply watching her like he still couldn't quite believe she was real. You should be sleeping, she murmured. I tried. I kept needing to check you were still breathing. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, feeling the tension in them finally, slowly begin to loosen. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not again. I ran once because I was afraid of what I'd become to you. I'm not afraid anymore. What changed? You walked into a warehouse full of armed men without hesitating because you couldn't stand the idea of a world with me missing from it. She smiled, small and unsteady. A man like that doesn't acquire someone, Dae-hyun. He builds his whole life around her. His throat worked, emotion breaking across his features in a way boardrooms and rival empires never got to witness. Then let me build the rest of it with you, properly, not as a woman I protect. As my wife, if you'll let me ask you that question the way it deserves to be asked. He asked it a week later, on the same rooftop where she used to escape to breathe, city lights spread gold and endless beneath a clear autumn sky. No cameras, no gala, no whispering elite, just Dae-hyun on one knee, a ring in his trembling hand, and the raw, unguarded truth of a man who had once believed he'd never want anything he couldn't afford to lose. I have spent my whole life being feared, he said. I never once wanted to be known. Then you looked at me like I was a person instead of an empire, and I have not wanted anything else since. Marry me, Aisha. Let the whole world see exactly what I would burn down for you, and let them see, too, what I would build instead. She said yes before he finished the sentence, laughing through tears as he lifted her off her feet, the city glittering silent witness beneath them. The wedding took place 3 months later, a quiet, fiercely guarded ceremony, half the city's elite in attendance, all of them finally understanding what Dae-hyun had known since a rain-soaked corridor changed the course of his life. Aisha wore a gown the color of the ivory silk she used to sketch in her cramped old apartment, back when Seoul had felt like nothing but survival. Dae-hyun watched her walk toward him like the rest of the room had ceased to exist, the way he always did, the way he suspected he always would. "You saved my life," she whispered as they stood before their families, her hand warm in his. "You saved mine first," he murmured back. "You just didn't know it yet." Spring came softer than either of them expected. Aisha's small design studio had grown, quietly, into something of its own, pieces inspired, she always said. By the night a stranger's coat had settled around her shoulders in a storm. Dae-hyun's empire ran steadier than it had in a decade, no longer weighed down by old grudges, finally settled and buried. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sunlight slanting warm across the kitchen counter, that Aisha set a small folded slip of paper in front of him without a word. He read it once, then again. When he looked up, the fear and fury that had once defined him in every dangerous room he'd ever walked into had softened into something entirely new, wonder, unguarded and complete. We are, she corrected, smiling through sudden tears. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and pulled her into him, forehead pressed to hers, hands splayed protective and reverent over the quiet, impossible miracle beginning between them. Outside, Seoul carried on the way it always did, indifferent to empires, indifferent to danger long since extinguished. While inside, a man who had once built walls around every soft thing in his life finally let himself believe that love, real love, was worth every wall he'd ever torn down to find it. "Love you," he whispered against her hair. "I have loved you since the moment you dropped a sketchbook in a corridor and looked at me like I wasn't something to fear. I love you too," she said, laughing and crying all at once. "Even when you told me to stay calm or you'd take me to your room." He laughed, rare, unguarded, entirely hers. "Best decision I ever made."